Right, so welcome everyone to our Zoom webinar with Daniel Mays, the author of Young Bellini. This is the first in a series of online events for this year's programming by the Catherine Frisone Scott Center for Italian Cultural Studies in memory of John B. Frisone. That is a fairly newly founded Center of Italian Studies and Research here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. We're a center that likes to and hopes to continue programming and encouraging study across the broad field of Italian studies, not just understood chronologically from the ancient to the modern, but also geographically. So anything that has to do with Italy, whether it's Renaissance painting like you'll hear about today, or issues of modern issues of immigration and emigration, Italian-American studies, et cetera, et cetera. So we like to think that we offer a wide array of programming in this field. And on that note, actually, I would like to plug our next event coming up next month on November 3rd, in which Asia Martin from Rice University will speak to us about the art of Mario Schifano, a wonderful 20th century artist who is now being exhibited under her curation in New York City right now. So please join us for that event as well. And of course, if you have the time to sign up on our listserv, you can find our information on the UMass Boston webpage, et cetera, or shoot us an email. So once again, today is a kind of a book presentation, if you will. Its author, Daniel Mays, is here with us today, and Daniel will first give us a bit of a overview of his book, after which we'll have a little discussion and then open up to questions and discussion. And if you have questions that you would like to ask Daniel, I will strongly encourage everyone to put them into the question and answer section that's at the bottom. That way we keep track of all the questions being asked. And if we would like to, we can also open it up to direct dialogue too. And so with that brief, I hope a brief preamble, let me introduce today's speaker. So it's my honor to introduce a wonderful scholar and friend, Daniel Wallace Mays, who is Fontaine Lee Duda Faculty Fellow of Renaissance Art, Assistant Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in Art History. Professor Mays completed his PhD in the history of Renaissance art at UCLA in 2013. And in that year, his article, Giovanni Bellini, Birth, Parentage, and Independence, in Renaissance Quarterly was runner-up for the Harvard University Vilaitati Prize for Best Published Essay by a Junior Scholar. And I think almost all of us, I think, in this field have read that. He held the Samuel H. Kress Predoctoral Fellowship in the History of Art at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence from 2011 to 2013. Fulbright Scholarship in the History of Art at the University of York from 2016 to 2017, and the Barbara Tome Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Huntington from 2017 to 2018. His research has been supported by fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment of the Humanities, and the Delmas Foundation. His new book, Young Bellini, offers a radically revised history of the early life and work of Giovanni Bellini, who is generally regarded as the most important artist of the 15th century in Venice. And let me plug it for a moment. This book will be available on October 26th in the United States on Amazon, and October 26th in Europe on Amazon, and November 16th in the USA. So let me say, it's a beautiful book, very affordable, great for Christmas presents. Professor Mays will give us an overview of the book's fundamental proposals, after which we'll chat a bit, as I mentioned, and we'll take questions from the audience. And I want to encourage everyone present to participate, whether you are a PhD in art history or one of our undergraduates here taking courses in Italianistica or the art of Venice. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Wallace Mays, and I'll ask Daniel now to share the screen.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bonanno, for that kind introduction and for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. We should never forget that the birth of Giovanni Bellini is one of the most ideological dates in the entire history of Italian art, wrote the historian Giovanni Augusti in 1993. And nearly 30 years later, the birth date of Giovanni Bellini remains at the center of a contentious debate among art historians. For those not familiar with Giovanni Bellini, he has long been recognized as the most important, perhaps the greatest artist of 15th century Venice and a leading innovator of Italian Renaissance art. His Agony in the Garden, perhaps the first compelling portrayal of sunrise in Italian art, depicts Christ asking his father to, quote, "Let this cup pass by me," as Roman soldiers approach in the background to arrest Christ. Bellini's Doge Loredan is considered among the great portraits of the Renaissance. Sebastian Smee of the Washington Post recently wrote, Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert is regarded by many as the most beautiful painting in America. I'm with the many. And most bars in the US and Europe will serve you a Bellini. That's a drink with peach puree and Prosecco, all also available pre-made, and which was named for the artist by Giuseppe Cipriani in around 1948. The pink glow my father had so admired in one of Bellini's paintings would be the inspiration for his famous cocktail. So why is knowing the date of Giovanni Bellini's birth so important to art historians? One reason is that it would enable scholars to establish a chronology for Giovanni's youthful paintings that would underlie an assessment of his early career. So here with the Agony in the Garden, it's been dated from around 1455 to as late as 1465 and even later. But more controversially, knowing Giovanni's date of birth would allow scholars to determine whether Giovanni was older or younger than the other major figure of early Renaissance art in northern Italy, the Paduan-trained Andrea Mantegna, who was born in circa 1431 or a little before. So this in turn would help scholars assess whether, as is currently debated, Giovanni was principally the originator or the recipient of the pictorial ideas deriving from their artistic duologue. Now, most specialists today believe that Giovanni Bellini was born in the second half of the 1430s, between 1435 and 1440, meaning Mantegna was perhaps 6 or 8 years older than Bellini. And most scholars believe that the line of artistic influence ran from Mantegna to Bellini and rarely or never in the other direction. And the relationship has often been presented as that between master and pupil, with Bellini eventually emerging from the umbrella of Mantegna's influence to form his own artistic identity. Now, since Giovanni Bellini was so important to the development of Venetian art, he apparently trained Giorgione and Titian, among other artists. And since Venetian art of this period is so crucial to the history of Western art, historians seek to understand Bellini's artistic development and the extent to which his early works were indeed influenced by Mantegna. And we see on the bottom that the National Gallery dates the Mantegna to 1455 or 1456, the Bellini a couple years later. So clearly the National Gallery is saying Mantegna's work came first, influenced Giovanni Bellini's work. My book, Young Bellini, explores Bellini's life up to circa 1450, including the previously unknown circumstances of his birth, his unusual upbringing in Venice, and his earliest works of art. I attribute several paintings to Giovanni for the first time, thereby revealing his youthful artistic practice. And the book also examines Giovanni's tremendous precocity in culling from a diverse range of visual sources. And it illuminates a number of other mysteries in the artist's life. But the reason for this short PowerPoint today is to present a research discovery that I first published in 2013, that I update in Appendix A of Young Bellini, and that lays important foundations for the book. And the discovery is this. It appears that Jacopo Bellini was not, this is the old family tree, and this is the family tree I'm proposing, that Jacopo Bellini was not Giovanni Bellini's father, as art historians have identified him since the 16th century, but instead was Giovanni Bellini's much older half-brother, the two being separated in age by over 30 years. And Jacopo apparently raised Giovanni as if a son. But my research also suggests that Giovanni Bellini was born in the middle of 1424 and September 13th, 1426. And that range of dates is 10 to 15 years earlier than currently believed by most scholars. I want to show you the archival evidence for this. This is the discovery that underlies my book. It's not what the book is about. It's the point of departure for the book. So the archival evidence recording Giovanni and Jacopo Bellini as biological brothers is this legal document. It's called a divisio, or a charter of division. It was drawn up on September 13th, 1440 by the Venetian notary Vittore Pomino to separate the property of two brothers, Giovanni and Jacopo Bellini, of the parish of San Gimignano, and both were the sons of the deceased Niccolo Bellini. So when this document was first published by Pauletti in 1929, it was understandably interpreted to mean that Jacopo Bellini not only had a son named Giovanni Bellini, the famous painter, but also a brother named Giovanni, the individual named in this divisio. And this interpretation appears to have been incorrect. The Giovanni Bellini identified as Jacopo's brother in the divisio is, I would suggest with little doubt, the famous artist Giovanni Bellini. And let me explain why. This 1440 divisio recording Jacopo and Giovanni Bellini as brothers, it was a very common notarial instrument, which, as its very first line says, was executed on behalf of the legitimately born brothers. The division to occur between the brothers is lawful, etc. When a father died in 15th century Venice, his legitimately born, unemancipated sons were immediately thrust into a fraternal partnership, a company, a kind of a company, and it owned the entirety of the father's estate, unless the father had willed some part of it otherwise. Fraternal partnerships were the most common form of business association among craftsmen and merchants in medieval and Renaissance Venice. They bound legitimate brothers together, both legally and financially, and that helped ensure that family businesses would remain intact rather than be dissolved upon the death of the patriarch. So this document records that on September 13th, 1440, the legitimately born brothers, Jacopo and Giovanni Bellini, terminated their fraternal partnership. Now, 11 days later, on September 24th, 1440, Jacopo Bellini engaged a different notary to draft a contract between himself and the painter Donato Bragadin to enter into a 5-year partnership. So apparently Jacopo needed to end the fraternal partnership with Giovanni in order to enter a business partnership with another party. And that would have been the reason for this document. So we can learn something about Giovanni Bellini from this and other documents. For instance, to agree to the divisio, Giovanni Bellini has to agree to it. He was legally required to be over the age of 14 to agree independently to the divisio. And that age of 14 is stated by a Venetian law declaring the male age of majority to be 14. So that means that Giovanni must have been born before September 13th, 1426, which is 14 years prior to this document. Now, the 1440 divisio also establishes that both Jacopo and Giovanni were legitimate sons of Niccolo or Nicoletto Bellini, because illegitimate sons did not enter into fraternal partnerships and had no such rights of inheritance. And that fact is important because 16 years earlier, on April 11th, 1424, Niccolo Bellini, Giovanni and Jacopo's father, he had a notary draw up his will. And in his will, he names Jacopo Bellini, one son, but he does not mention Giovanni Bellini at all in that will. Now, you have to understand that in medieval and Renaissance Venice, fathers are legally required to identify their legitimate sons in their wills, even if their intent was to disinherit them. Otherwise, the will could be overturned. So the omission of Giovanni from Niccolo or Nicoletto's 1424 will, it almost certainly means that he had not been born yet. And therefore, Giovanni Bellini must have been born after April 11, the Giovanni Bellini named in this document, after April 11, 1424, which was the date of Niccolo's will, yet before September 13, 1426, which was 14 years prior to this document. So Nicoletto Bellini's will is the last known record of Nicoletto being alive. He died sometime prior, Giovanni Bellini's father died sometime prior to July 23rd, 1429, because on that date, Jacopo Bellini signed a dowry receipt describing himself as the son of the deceased Nicoletto Bellini. So at that moment, Giovanni Bellini was no more than 4 years old. And he might even have been still in his mother Franceschina's womb when his father died. We don't know. The existing evidence also suggests that Giovanni's mother, whose name was Franceschina, she herself probably died. We don't have any information about her when she was very young. She might have died during childbirth. The reason I say this is after Nicoletto's 1424 will, and she's mentioned in the will, we have no known documents that name her. And by the year 1440, Giovanni is living in the parish of San Gimignano, presumably with Jacopo Bellini, who's also living there. He's not living in the parish of San Salvador, where his father and his mother had lived. So the Giovanni Bellini named in the divisio is I would suggest, Jacopo's half-brother, that these two figures are actually one figure, the half-brother, that Jacopo raised as if a son, right? If they're not the same, if they were not the same, then there were two boys named Giovanni Bellini, both under the age of 16 in the year 1440, both living in the Venetian parish of San Gimignano, both lineal descendants of Niccolo Bellini, and both closely connected to and likely residing in Jacopo Bellini's household. One, becoming a renowned painter, and the other, Jacopo Bellini's half-brother, leaving not a single conclusive trace of his existence, except for that one document, the Divisio of 1440. Moreover, there exists no evidence. There's not a single document, signature, or inscription demonstrating that there was a second Giovanni Bellini directly related to Jacopo Bellini. And the Giovanni Bellini named in the Divisio was born between 1424 and 1426. That's a range within which the writer Giorgio Vasari in the year 1550 indicated that Giovanni Bellini was born. Vasari said that Giovanni Bellini had died at the age of 90 in 1516, and he therefore would have been born in 1425 or 1426. Now, a new document discovery published just a few weeks ago by the Italian scholar Alessia Menegan supports this range of birth dates. The document records that on October the 2nd, 1447, in Florence, Giovanni Bellini contractually agreed to purchase a used coat from a second-hand dealer. And the contract describes Giovanni as maestro, you see it here, maestro or magistro, Giovanni Bellini, Pictori de Venitis, or Master Giovanni Bellini, painter of Venice. And as Menegan argues, Giovanni almost certainly was over the age of 18 at the moment of this document, both to enter into the contract in Florence, where you had to be 18 there, and to be called a painting master. So the document alone suggests a birth date for the artist prior to 1429. So the best interpretation of the available documentary and there's visual evidence as well, which I haven't described, is that Giovanni Bellini was Jacopo Bellini's half-brother, and that Giovanni was born between mid-1424 and September 13th, 1426. And that, of course, means that Giovanni Bellini was not younger than Andrea Mantegna, but in fact was a few years older. And I believe in the coming years, scholars will begin to reconsider the direction of the lines of influence between Bellini and Mantegna. So this research that I just presented, it constitutes not what the book is about, but just some of the groundwork upon which young Bellini is built. And allow me to end this presentation here so that Professor Buonanno and I can discuss the book itself. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think we're all clapping, of course, from where we are tuning in. Thank you for that very, very, very helpful, I think, overview for all our audience today on sort of the background of the book and on the question, again, that, as you said, is the foundation for a study that then really realigns a major kind of narrative of 15th century art, and not really just in Venice, but it's a pretty central one to all of what we call, you know, Renaissance art or early modern Venice. And might I also add, it's beautifully illustrated in the book itself with copious illustrations that I think reinforce the documentary evidence that you have given, and maybe we'll have a chance to look at some of that too. So reading the book, I had a few general kind of thoughts that I thought maybe we could start with. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those, and then maybe we can move towards more specific things, and then we'll take questions from the audience. When I first read it, what I was really struck by was kind of the boldness that it exhibits. I mean, it's a very bold direction, and for those who don't know Venetian studies as well, taking on the question of when Giovanni Bellini is born is a big one. It's fraught. There are some very strong opinions on the various sides as to when he is born. How did you find yourself going down that, in this case, I think, very convincing rabbit hole?
Um, well, I'm from New York City. I grew up in New York City, and we don't trust people when you grow up in New York City because you get mugged on the street a lot if you end up trusting people. And so when I was doing research on Gentili Bellini in the archives, and I was in Venice, and I was thinking about this divisio and doing research on and asking myself whether Giovanni and Gentili were legitimately born, whether they were emancipated, which is something else entirely. And I saw that Giovanni Bellini had this brother. Jacopo Bellini had this brother named Giovanni, and I was like, oh, that's curious. What else do we know about him? And it turns out we know nothing. We didn't know anything about him. There's no other document or evidence about him. And I said, well, that's kind of strange. That's what a coincidence is, brother. And I said, what? It's kind of strange. And that was my first inkling of there's something wrong here in this story that we're being told. And it's not like scholars are lying to us. Of course, they're trying to construct, a powerful narrative based on the evidence. But I started then looking more deeply, and I wanted to know exactly what these legal documents meant and what we could learn from them. And that was then the point of departure for spending about a year learning about Venetian law of the 15th century and trying to figure out, what we could learn by these legal documents. And I departed, I said, I'm sorry, Gentili. I departed from Gentili for quite a bit, and I went into this question just to answer it for myself and to understand what was going on for myself. And then I think when you start looking and little bits of evidence start to support themselves in different ways. And I think the truth does that. I think when you're on a line that's not the truth, things start to conflict, and you have documents that can't be explained, and when things start to click, suddenly every little thing gets to be explained is like, oh, that's how it happened, and that's what happened, and so things started to fall into place, and I kept on going down that road.
I like that very much because, what really impressed me in the book was the depth of knowledge that was required of the legal system. As so much of what's been shown to have an effect on this artistic narrative was discovered through an analysis really of legal procedure and documentation, which is, I think the general public doesn't think we do things like that in art history, that maybe we're just relying on paintings, but that you essentially had to become an expert in Venetian law to untangle what is a centuries old kind of conundrum. On that note, I thought that was quite impressive, but is there anything that you are particularly proud of in the book in addition to that?
There are a few other sort of discoveries that you make discoveries along the way. And there was one that I was proud of. It was very small, but sometimes in Niccolo Bellini's will, there's an added statement in that will. It's added at the end, and it looks like it's part of the will. But you realize when you look at it more closely that it's an additional statement that the notary probably came back to the will later to add it. And I make the case in the book that it was to correct a mistake that he, I don't want to give away too much, but it suggests that he came back to the will to cover his own butt. And it's impossible to forcefully make make the argument. So I put it out there, but I feel pretty sure that it's the case. And he did not initially ask Niccolo whether he was expecting any additional children or what to do about posthumous children if Niccolo died. And that was a standard question that notaries are supposed to ask when you take the will, because what happens is when the father makes a will, right? You make your will, you're a dad, and then you have a son born after the will, that will is immediately terminated. It's ruptured because the son has rights. And if you do not mention the son in the will, then the will is bad, and it does not function as a will. And so the notary is supposed to say, what do you want to do about sons that come along after we make this will? Or if you die and your wife happens to be pregnant, what if a son comes along? What do you, so the notary is supposed to ask that. And he didn't, the notary didn't ask. Why didn't Niccolo, he asked Niccolo, maybe because Niccolo was so old. He was in his 60s maybe, but he didn't ask that. But that's exactly what happened. That after Niccolo made that will, then Giovanni Bellini came along and the will was ruptured, right? So the notary at some point came to the will and said, wrote a little thing at the end saying, when asked about posthumous children, he said it wasn't necessary. He wrote a little sentence at the very end of the will. And I feel like that not only confirms this whole narrative, but also that the notary, but it was very hard to think about the notary doing that, and very hard to make that case in writing, because we always think that these documents are sacred. They're created in one instant, you know, what they say is exactly true. So one of the things that I try to do is I try to think about who's in the room when the document is created, how is the document created, who is, you know, how are certain words end up in the document. And so I was just very pleased with that. And I showed my wife, and she didn't actually think it was all that great, but I thought it was great. I thought it was really hard to figure out. And it was very difficult. I wrote about 100 drafts of that passage in the book, try to simplify why I thought that. So
I think it's a very important passage, and it's one of the numerous examples, I think, throughout the book that contribute a sense of, shall we say, you know, a slice of life, where we're not just operating in these high echelons of artistic creation, but there's the nitty gritty of everyday life there. There's dying young or losing a parent even before one is 1 year old. Jacopo Bellini being stuck in prison for several years. And then there's, again, these nuts and bolts of everyday kind of bureaucracy, something that, as we know, has not left Italian or American society. It's very much identifiable to a modern reader. And one thing that also really kind of struck me about this, it almost seems banal until you start to think about the repercussions, right? That maybe someone's legal documents are a little bit different, but that it's a butterfly effect that will then kind of shake what happens later. You know, what's the big deal about him being born 5 to 15 years early? It really resets not only when he developed, but how he developed over his career. What I really got a sense of through the book was just how much of a late medieval painter he began as. And for those who are familiar with Giovanni Bellini, by the end, he's, you know, a very modern painter. He's, you know, almost a high Renaissance painter in some ways. You have brought some images, perhaps, of the famous Ferrara Coronation that you've attributed as his first painting. It might be interesting to kind of see those, if we can show the audience.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, this painting came to light in the 80s, and you would never look at it and think it was executed by Giovanni Bellini. Everyone would laugh at you because it has no, you know, it doesn't have any relationship to his style, what we think of as his style. But if you look on the Old Testament saint, it is signed, Johannes Bellinus me fecit, Giovanni Bellini made me. And so when people found this painting, they're like, who is this? Who could this be? And then they said, oh, well, maybe it's Jacopo Bellini's brother. There was a brother mentioned in one of the documents. Maybe it's that guy. Maybe it's that Giovanni. So they sort of made up this figure that they called Giovanni Bellini il Vecchio, Giovanni Bellini the Elder. And they said, oh, and they attributed this painting to him. But it's, you know, that's fanciful, in my view. We can see how the painting partially emerges from Jacopo Bellini's notebooks, which is so true of Giovanni's early works. And remember, Giovanni is 15 or 16 years old, in my view, when he paints this. And if you can see the balconies here and the recession, some of these kinds of ideas are really coming very much out of Jacopo's notebooks, and Giovanni is digesting these motifs, making the motifs his own. And ideas such as these roundels with figures in them. Again, we see them in elsewhere as well, but we see them in Jacopo's notebooks. And the Madonna, of course, herself in the Ferrara Coronation is very much a Jacopo Bellini type of Madonna. So we can now, with an earlier birthday, we can take that painting and we can say, okay, we don't have to make up Giovanni Bellini the elder and have him have his whole career. We can look at that painting and say that is a painting that's coming from Jacopo Bellini's notebook drawings. Was what we would expect from a 16 or 15-year-old, slightly precocious, maybe not as precocious as Mantegna, artist, looking at Jacopo, looking at influences. And in the book, I mentioned a lot of influences on this painting, all very much within, or most of them right where Giovanni is living, and seeing how he's constructing his works at age 16. And I just find that it's really remarkable. He's such a sponge as a teenager, as a 15 or 16-year-old, and he remains one his entire career. He's always soaking up other artists' innovations and works in right in, until he's a very old man, when he's looking at the work of Giorgione. So it starts early with him.
Do we have an example, perhaps, to show everyone of one of those later works?
Oh,
I didn't. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Right.
I
That's
didn't.
quite all right. I might be able to call one up, but it's stunning because when you see the works that the book focuses on, one might momentarily think, oh, so Bellini starts off as, again, it's late medieval painter, and as you say, not precocious. But then when you recognize how long his career is and the dramatic shift from those early works to what he paints already in the 1470s, 80s, not to mention the early 1500s, that's an arc of development that is almost unmatched, at least in that century. And in the next, and I would love anyone to correct me on this, I can only think of someone like Raphael, who has such a dramatic change in style in Raphael's career, one that's very brief. But Bellini's is so different from start to finish that I think that's more impressive. Knowing that, I don't think it detracts anything from the idea of him as a fully formed artist. If anything, it makes him look more interested in learning and in synthesizing and improving, which, as we know, is an important part of the Renaissance narratives that are spun. I think especially about Giorgio Vasari, who is very much a fan of any artist who has talent but then builds on it or works to improve. That was really quite striking in this case. And maybe it's time to answer some questions. We can answer questions from the audience by hand, but also let me start with the ones that were in the Q&A, and then we'll move to the ones in the chat. And if people would like to raise their hands, that is fine too. So the first question, is from our own Vetri Nathan here in the Foreign Languages Department, who wondered, what have you're gonna love this one, Daniel. What have the reactions been to this evidence by art historians in Italy?
Oh, I've been warmly embraced all around. No, I'm kidding. What's the opposite of being warmly embraced? It's so funny because when I sort of made this discovery, I was writing my dissertation, and then I was thinking, oh my God, I think I solved some of the major problems in Bellini's chronology. Everyone's going to be so happy when I come out and I publish this, and people are going to be like, oh, finally we realize what's going on. So I was thinking, I was expecting, and then everyone's going to I was going to be hoisted on the shoulders and walk around, and everyone's going to buy me Bellini for the rest of my life, walking any, oh, hey, Bellini.
Daniel.
It's Daniel, get him a Bellini. No, not at all. It's the issue is that a lot of scholars have published a lot of their own research and founded on the idea that Bellini is born in 1435 or later, and they have spent, you know, a lot of time looking at the paintings and creating their own chronologies and when somebody comes out and says, okay, you're wrong, you have to change your chronologies, the early works are all, you have to rethink it all, they're like, no, you're wrong, you're the one who's wrong. So there have been a lot of scholars who have been very kind and are and see the arguments and you know, are waiting to see what's coming around, but are getting persuaded. But then there's a number of other scholars who were not persuaded at all and who wish I would go away, and who, when they write about Bellini, they don't even mention this in recent publications. They don't even mention this new chronology or the possibility of it. They just, it's as if I never published my article in 2013. So hopefully that this book will lay the groundwork. And I think what has to happen is that we need new scholars to come in who are fresh and look at all the evidence, who haven't published 3 books on Bellini and this and whatever, and have no, you know, no axe to grind. And then they can look at all the evidence. And I think when that happens, they'll see, I believe, that this is the best way to explain the evidence that exists now, right at this moment. Now, who's to say we don't find a document in the future or something else that shifts things? But right now, and again, you know, the document found just a few weeks ago is confirming that this chronology that I lay out is gonna, I feel like it's going to be embraced in the future, but maybe not right now.
Hopefully the book will be an unavoidable you know, source that one must at least consult or contend with. And I think also we can move to some other questions too then. Based on the revised birth date for Giovanni, that would mean that he lived to more than 90 years. Do primary sources speak at all about his advanced age at death? It would have been, of course, especially remarkable in that era.
Yeah. First of all, it's not that remarkable. We were taught to think it's that remarkable in that era, but there have been some recent studies that people did live to over 100 in Venice, and there's evidence of people living well into their 90s. So hitting 90 is not, it's nice, but, you know, I mean, other people, other artists, Michelangelo almost got there. So I think he would be about 91 when he died. And Vasari, he was old enough for Vasari to comment on it. Obviously, it impressed Vasari. Vasari wrote he's 90 when he died. That's actually the first indication of any of his date of birth, and it happens in 1550. So it happens 34 years after Giovanni dies. Vasari says, "Oh, he died at the advanced age of 90." So that seems to have been pretty close, and maybe even right on. Usually, we think Vasari just said he lived very, you know, we would interpret it, oh, he just lived very old, but that actual figure is really, I think it's pretty close. What disturbs art historians is that he was continuing to paint in his last years, and they want autograph Giovanni Bellini paintings from the last 2 or 3 years, and can somebody in their 80s paint these or achieve these? And maybe some of these paintings have to be rethought. Either we have to say, yes, he was a very spirited individual in his late 80s, and that's still painted, or maybe the workshop is helping a little bit more than one would, one would have thought previously. But I don't really have a problem with it. I know a lot of people have mentioned that.
And it brings to mind, of course, that even Albrecht Dürer mentions Bellini as being still perfectly capable, if not more so. So there's this interesting correlation between that later literary evidence that lines up with kind of your forensic evidence of much earlier. So you and I were talking about coincidence in art history, and at a certain point, there's enough coincidences where it tips the scales towards probability. It seems so particularly apt here. There's still more questions coming in, which is wonderful. So let me read those instead of taking up the time myself. So there are two questions from Maximilian Hernandez, who has asked, has the Ferrara Coronation been restored recently? In other words, could anyone contest the signature is original on a technical basis?
Yes, it has been restored, and they do believe that the signature is original to the painting. And who in their right mind would not, and if it wasn't original, who in their right mind would write Giovanni Bellini painted this, on a painting that looks nothing like a work by Giovanni Bellini? But yes, it is evidently considered original to the work.
And then the second question was, have you associated any additional paintings to the Ferrara Coronation as a Giovanissimo Bellini group? So that is the extremely early Bellini group.
Yes, I actually don't want to mention those here because I think it'd be fun to sort of read the book and for them to come out. But yes, and I hope that you will agree with the attributions in the book. I think they're compelling, and it's amazing to see. If you do agree with them, then it's really amazing to see his early pictorial development and what he's looking at, what concerns him, how he's constantly looking to Jacopo's notebooks, but also to the people, to the artists that influenced Jacopo, like Gentili da Fabriano, like Altichiero. Altichiero and Gentili da Fabriano are the two artists I would suggest that most influenced Jacopo Bellini. And when Giovanni's young, they're influencing him too in very direct ways. It's fascinating to see, and in some ways, it's expected because you're young. You look to the person who raised you, right? You see and respect that individual, and their heroes become your heroes initially.
I think we have a question coming to us very live. So we're bucking the Zoom trend. And so for this question, we're going to go like this. Matteo Casini, you have the floor.
Well, I have to tell everybody that in Venice, we don't do Zoom anymore. I mean, if you want to participate with Zoom, yes, but now we are restarted meeting all in person. So I welcome again to come back in Venice and do our conferences. Also, Daniel, there will be an important, I don't know if it might be on Zoom actually. I might tell you a new conference on Leonardo Loredan, the Doge represented by Giovanni Bellini on the 25th and 26th of November. I don't know if it's in Zoom, but it should be, I think, at the Istituto Veneto. And I think that for all of you working on Giovanni Bellini, it should be a very, very interesting conference. I think there are also one or two papers about Giovanni Bellini's portrait of Leonardo Loredan. I will talk myself, but about the Loredan family and the Vittore Carpaccio Sant'Orsola cycle. But sorry about that. No, my question is, you put on screen here, and I was looking at your book. You also quite often quoted Jacopo Bellini's notebooks, which are very important to me because, as you know, I'm working on the Compagnia della Calza, and I'm actually discovering a lot of interesting things. And when you will be back in Venice, we will talk about it on those drawings, not just about one representation that, in my opinion, might well be a representation of Compagnia della Calza in the drawings, but also about the general atmosphere of, of the Jacopo Bellini's drawings, really, as other scholars have already written, taken by the chivalric atmosphere of, the first half, European chivalric atmosphere and taste of the first half of the 15th century. Which, after this new young study, then what do you think was the relationship? Why are you using so much the Jacopo Bellini's drawings for understanding Giovanni Bellini's youth?
It's thanks for that question, Matteo. This is something that I discuss quite a bit in the book, and it's the specific approach that Giovanni takes to creating a work of art. And it's not like he goes to the empty canvas and starts painting. These works of art are much more engineered, like a vehicle in some ways, where he's looking at different parts and he's selecting and choosing different motifs that he wants to incorporate in his work. There's a tremendous, what he does is he goes around Venice and he looks at things and he says, that is nice, I want to incorporate that in my work, that motif, that part. It could be architecture, other paintings, frescoes, and then a lot he comes back to Jacopo Bellini's notebooks. They're in, of course, the workshop. He goes through them and he selects what he likes, and that's what they're there for, right? That's why you have, in part, I mean, they're multifunction, but in part you're not working, no one is hiring you, so you make these very involved drawings, from which you can be inspired or get ideas for motifs or entire compositions. That's exactly their intention, in part, and that's how Giovanni is using them. What's interesting is, and I just delivered a paper on this a few weeks ago, he continues to use Jacopo Bellini's notebooks through his teenage years into his 20s. He uses ideas from them directly. I mean, copying motifs and flipping them and using them in his paintings. He continues to use them even after Jacopo dies. Jacopo dies and he's still going back to those notebooks. And you might ask why? Well, maybe for horses. Jacopo was a brilliant artist when he drew horses. And
talking about the chivalric culture.
I mean, he was just brilliant. And when Giovanni has to paint, horses, well, he doesn't want to reinvent the horse, he doesn't want to start from scratch. He goes to Jacopo's notebooks and he traces the horses that he likes, and then he alters them. He might flip one, whatever he needs, but it's started there. And that seems to be how he worked. He liked using models that he appreciated, that he knew were good, and then he would make them his own. He would flip them, he would adjust them, he would make them so you couldn't even see that they were models from someone else. And Jacopo's notebooks he kept on returning to. So I point out a lot, especially in his youth, he's working from getting a lot of ideas from Jacopo's books, and he must have just really respected Jacopo and loved him.
Yes, if I may add only one thing that I was thinking about while you were talking, while you're saying this. Also, the chronology might fit actually, because when the drawings came out, it's like 40. I mean, so Giovanni was already almost adolescent, so it must be possibly one of the first things that he really used when he was starting to do his work as a painter. No, I mean, if it's correct, your analysis, your hypothesis on 40-25, it would have been around 15 or 16 when the drawings were completely. So it was really at the beginning of his formation as a painter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's also interesting is Jacopo doesn't know how to draw in linear perspective when he starts the Paris notebook. So you get these drawings that are they look good to the eye, but they're actually not in precise linear perspective. And Giovanni is present watching Jacopo, when Giovanni is young, learn how to execute works in Albertian linear perspective. And Giovanni is learning with him, learning with Jacopo. And then, of course, Giovanni's later works, he knows perspective, scientific perspective so well, doesn't even have to think about constructing it. But in the very early works, Jacopo didn't quite know how to do it. So in some senses, he's learning from Jacopo. In another sense, maybe they were learning together, even though Giovanni is so much younger. He seems to be precocious, and he just seems to, very soon, he's going to outpace Jacopo in everything, right? In any kind of, except maybe horses, but and he's just a few years away from almost outdoing Jacopo.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matteo, for a great question. If there are other questions from the audience, we can also take them live. I can activate your camera if you would like to speak. Otherwise, I do have one last question for Daniel, and then maybe we'll let him go if there's no others. So this is quite a complete reappraisal of the early career of Giovanni Bellini, and most studies on the painter have generally focused on the Catalogue Raisonné or his broad career. What's your next move? What's the next book? Are you going to continue to work on Bellini?
Yes, I have a lot more to say. I've got a lot more to say, and a lot of other little discoveries that I want to publish. This book, it takes Bellini up to 1450, and that would be a laugh riot for a lot of Italians and others who say that he was born in 1440, because it would have taken him to age 10. But this book, it doesn't go very far. It takes him to about, in my chronology, about the age of 25. I stopped there for particular reasons, and I wanted a short, concise book, and I wanted to lay a lot of groundwork. But I would like to write the next decade. I would like to discuss the new, the document discovery in Florence that situates Giovanni in Florence in 1447, which is fascinating, looking to buy a coat, almost winter. And I would start there, and I would take him up through the next 10 years, and I would discuss his relationship, more about his relationship with Mantegna, and how he develops a signature. And I would want to look at those paintings of the 1450s and see how his development continues. So that would be the next book that I'm thinking of embarking on, and I've already started writing it, in fact.
Wonderful. Well, we certainly look forward to that then. It doesn't look like we have other questions. We've certainly covered a lot of ground there. And once again, let me first of all plug your book for everyone. This is called Young Bellini by Daniel Mays. It's available very soon through Yale University Press. You can find it online. And again, makes a wonderful Christmas present for that scholar or budding scholar or Venetian enthusiast in your household. So please join me in thanking Daniel. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing this wonderful discovery with us. So we can clap and make some noise here because you'll hear us. What else can, of course, clap at home. So grazie mille, Daniel.
Grazie.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
Congratulazioni.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
And I think with that, we can conclude. And once again, I'll remind everyone that we'll have another presentation on November 3rd with Asia Martin from Rice University. And if you haven't yet, please sign up on our mailing list. There's a link in the chat. And keep your eyes peeled for future events from our Center here for Italian Studies. So thank you all for your time, and thank you, Daniel. And buona serata a tutti.
Ciao.